Hi, this is Dan Heisman. We're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. Today we're going to go over an amateur game. This game was played earlier this year in Stockholm, and Black was the higher rated player in the tournament and the game in this tournament. So let's take a look. White opened up e4. Black played d6, that's the Pierce defense. And White plays the number one move, d4. Black plays knight f6, main line. White plays knight c3, and now the main line is to play g6. Instead, Black decides to transpose into a Philidor defense, and Black plays e5. So a lot of people I know, when they see this kind of position, they jump right on d takes e, queen takes d8, king takes d8, figuring, well, Black can't castle, so that's good for White. And it's true that this line is obviously not bad for White. The problem is that without the queens on the board, the Black's inability to castle doesn't hurt that much. Black will just play c6 and tuck his king into c7. And a lot of people who offer this kind of thing are very good at endgames, or they like queenless chess, so they offer this opening so that they can get into the kind of game they want. And here, with Black being the higher rated player, we have to assume that's the case, that Black likes to play these kind of positions and feels like he could outplay White in the queenless game. So White plays the move that I think a lot of grandmasters would play here, which is to simply play knight f3 and transpose back into a Philidor defense instead of, pawn takes, queen takes d8 check. So knight f3, very good move. Black plays knight bd7. And now White needs to figure out what he wants to do with regard to his king and the bishop that's in the way for castling. Let's ask Stockfish here what Stockfish would do. Stockfish says all three bishop moves, bishop e2, bishop d3, bishop c4, are reasonable. Most people here are going to play bishop c4, and that's what White played in the game. Nothing wrong with that move. And now Black normally plays a move like either c6 or bishop e7. Probably bishop e7 is slightly more accurate. That way Black can answer knight g5 with castles. If he plays c6 and knight g5, he can go for complications, but let's ask the computer. c6, computer says, is no good because White can take here first. If Black takes with the pawn, then knight g5 is going to be very strong. And if Black takes with the knight, now White can win a pawn with knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes check. This is a good example of that ABC, CBA kind of thing. If you're someone who saw queen takes, king takes, bishop f7, and then jumps on it, sometimes you have to take your time and ask yourself, maybe it's a better move order to reverse the move order. Instead of playing ABC, play CBA and play bishop checks first, king up. And now if you want to trade queens, you can. The difference would be we reach the exact same position, but now it's White's move instead of Black's move. So White's up an entire tempo on the position that you would reach if you played queen takes queen first. Queen takes, king takes, bishop takes. Now in this position, it's Black's move instead of White's. Either way, White's in good shape, but it's sometimes better when you see a sequence to look at other permutations of the move order to see if some of them are better, and that's a good example. So c6 is not as good. And bishop e7 with the idea of castling is good. By the way, if White plays knight g5 and Black castles, and White goes for bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, knight e6, queen e8, knight takes c7, queen d8, knight takes a8. Superficially, this looks really good for White. Right now, he is up the exchange in a pawn. The problem is he's got his knight trapped in the corner, and at best he's going to get a pawn for it. So here the computer says that Black is actually slightly better after a move like b5 threatening bishop to b7. And it gives Black as a slight advantage. So even though this is a common pattern that you see a lot in amateur games, it's not really nearly as good for White as it looks. All right, let's go back to the game. In the game, White did not play knight to g5, but I wanted to show you that line because it's a very tempting line for white to play. White instead played castles, which is probably just better. And now black plays c6. Black could castle first. Stockfish says that's the best move. But c6 is a good move in these kind of openings. Now that knight g5 is not a threat, and black is ready to expand with either b5 or d5. And here, the number one move for white, which is a move you don't see amateurs play too much, is to play a4 right away to stop black from playing b5. And the game might continue something like castle, and then maybe Stockfish gives bishop e3, knight g4, harassing the bishop. And white wants to keep that bishop on the board. Computer says bishop c1, which is basically a draw offer. So let's say black moves the knight back. Then white says, okay, now that you've called my bluff, let's play h3 so I can put my bishop on e3. And white has a typical opening advantage here, about 3/10 of a pawn. All right, so back to the game. In the game, white didn't play a4. In the game, white plays a move that's not very good. He plays bishop to b3. Let's move it up and look at the top bunch of moves here. Whoops. What I want to do is keep the video centered. Okay, and we're going to look at the top 6 or 7 moves here for white. All right, so if you look at the top 7 moves below the board, bishop to b3 doesn't make the top 7. And let's talk a bit about why that is. Let's first put the screen back to where, because I see people doing this a lot, and one of the things I do as an instructor is I ask my students, why did you make that move? So when I ask my students, why did you play bishop to b3? They say, well, the bishop is vulnerable on c4. He can attack it with b5. He might even be able to play the center fork trick, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, d5, which in this case would not be that good. Let's say white plays a different move here. Let's say white plays a4. And black tries knight takes e4. Here, white can not only play knight takes e4, which is probably good for white. It is. Knight e4, d5, queen e2. If black tries to win his piece back, then queen takes e4. Hitting this pawn again. If he tries to save the pawn by taking it, knight g5, and now he can't castle because queen takes h7 as mate. So white can also, besides the fact that play knight takes e4, he can play bishop f7 check, king f7, knight takes e4, and if black tries to get his rook in the game with something like rook f8, then knight g5 check, and this square is weak. Black can't move his king away from that square, and if he plays king to f6, white can just play a move like queen d3, and the computer says white's ahead by like 7 pawns. So basically, it's true that black can do those things, but the best way to stop b5 is to just play a4. If you think on b5 you're going to play bishop b3 anyway, there's no reason to play it now. If you think bishop b3 is safe, then just wait till he plays b5 and then play bishop to b3. Because what if you play bishop b3 now and he never plays b5? Then you just spend an extra tempo moving a piece twice when you really didn't have to. So a lot of people do that. They make these prophylactic moves where they prevent something that's not really a threat, trying to prevent a threat from happening, but it's not an unstoppable threat. b5 is not a winning move. It's just an attack on the bishop. So they move the bishop back here, and you really don't want to do that. The best way to stop b5 is to play a4. Playing moves that react because your opponent might do something anyway, and then you might have to do something. As long as you have a good defense, as long as b5 is not a winning tactic or anything, there's no reason to, move the bishop in anticipation of that. I see people do that all the time, and you don't see good players do that often. They will do things like that occasionally, especially if the move is very awkward to meet if you make another move first. But to just play bishop b3 here is kind of a mistake. All right, so white plays bishop b3. It's not terrible, but the computer says now black's a little better. Suggests black should play b5 anyway, and this bishop's a little awkward. White plays Oh, sorry. Black just castles. Computer says now if white plays a4, he's doing okay. And white does find a4. Good for white. All right, so white understands that he needs that pawn up there in this kind of a pawn structure for space. A lot of my students who play this kind of pawn structure, they never play a4. And then they end up with a game where black gets a lot of space and they wonder what they did wrong. But here, white's doing okay. The game's about even. Here, black can win the bishop pair. And he does. He takes the pawn. He takes d4. White takes with the knight. And knight c5 hits e4 twice and hits the bishop. The bishop, of course, is guarded, so the big problem is saving the e-pawn. White plays his best move, rook e1. And black says thank you for the bishop pair. And white does not want to wreck his pawn structure, so he correctly takes back with the knight. And we've reached a position where white has more space, black has the bishop pair. The chances are about even. Black here plays rook to e8, putting his rook on the semi-open file. And white probably wants to put his bishop on e3 here, but he doesn't want to allow knight to g4. So it makes some sense here to play h3 to stop knight g4. We're not stopping bishop g4, which is not much of a threat. It's the fact that the knight can hit the bishop's best square. As I said in my novice nook on Guide to Pawn to Rook 3, you rarely play pawn to rook 3 to prevent the bishops from coming there. I mean, occasionally you do. Obviously, you do in the main line of the closed Roy Lopez. But you very often do it to prevent knights from going there if you want to put a bishop on d3 or b3, d3 or e3. So here, h3 makes sense. White plays bishop g5, but this is not a pin. This is just really moving into a discovered attack. The good news is that if black moves that knight, you can trade bishops and get rid of the bishop pair. So black does move the knight, knight to g4. And here white should jump on the chance to get rid of the bishop pair. For instance, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. White can overprotect his e-pawn with a move like f3 or f3, or he could drive the knight away, let's say h3. Knight back to f6 to hit the pawn. Queen guards it the third time. This d-pawn's a little weak. Bishop e6. Knight back to the center, d4. Rook a d8 with an equal game. All right, so back to the game. So white plays a very strange move here. Instead of getting rid of the bishop pairs on the average are worth about a half a pawn, he plays bishop to f4. Well, that does hit this d-pawn, which is slightly backward, on the semi-open d-file. And it does guard the h2 square in case the black queen ever gets out to h4, but it wasn't worth the tempo to move the bishop away and to avoid the bishop trade. So black here plays knight to e5. Nice square for the knight. And white would like to drive it away with f4 at some point, but of course he can't here. His bishop's in the way. So the engine suggests white should play h3 again, giving white that bishop e3 square and also taking away g4 not only from the knight but from the bishop with about an equal position. Instead, white does play h3. Okay, very good for white with about an equal position. And now it suggests black should play the interesting move bishop h4, probably keeping an eye on the f2 square. Black instead plays bishop g5, again offering the trade of the bishops. And now white gets a little scared and says, gee, if I take that bishop, I'm putting the queen on the same line with my king. And that is a concern, but it's just a concern, not a winning threat. For instance, after the right move, bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. The threat is bishop takes h3 with a sneaky pin. You can't take the bishop because it's pinned to the king, and the best way to stop that is just play rook e3. Now that the knight can't go to g4 and there's no dark squared bishop to harass the rook e3 works, because if black plays knight to c4, white gets a nice tempo to put his rook on the same line with the queen and the king. Black would save the queen. And now the computer suggests that white's best move is knight to d2, simply offering to trap that knight if it takes on b2. For instance, knight takes b2, queen to b1, and there's nowhere to put the knight. Let's say black counterattacks the knight here on d2 with queen f4. Then rook e3 saves the knight and protects the knight on d2's ability to stop the other knight from going to c4. And that knight on b2 is lost. Okay, so white should take the bishop and play rook e3, but it is a little tricky. You have to see that the knight could get trapped on b2, and that's not easy to see. So we can understand why white's reluctant to do that. Let's see what his second best move is. Stockfish says the second best move is just play queen d2 and hit that bishop twice, so that he can't play knight c4. You just play bishop takes g5, knight takes d2, bishop takes d8, knight takes b3, c takes b3, rook takes d8. And we have an equal endgame where white's got doubled pawns. The computer says after b4, white's slightly better. So bishop takes g5 is best, queen d2 is second. White plays a really weird move here. He plays bishop back to c1, I guess trying to keep an eye on that b2 pawn. But that kind of gives black a free rein here. So the next few moves is where white starts to go downhill a little bit. Black brings the queen into the attacking area with queen f6. Notice white has 5 of his pieces on the queen side, so black starts putting his pieces on the king side. And here white should again trade the bishop, but since he didn't do it before, we'd suspect he wouldn't do it now. So he starts to bring the knight back over to the king side with knight d2. Computer doesn't like that move, says bishop takes bishop is the best and equal. Here black should play maybe queen g6 or h6. Black plays bishop h4, hitting the pawn, and white should just guard it with the rook on f1. Not e2 where he blocks the queen and the knight. Just play rook to f1. People hate to do that. They hate to undevelop their pieces that way, but here it's clearly the best move and white's close to equality if he does that. Instead he plays the natural looking move queen to e2, developing the queen and getting into the game. The problem is the queen's not the best defender for f2, but, you know, I might make that kind of mistake too, so certainly can't be critical about a move like queen e2. Black plays d5, breaking in the middle. Computer says, oh, I can take it. I've got it attacked twice. It's only guarded once. So this is a key part of the game, in that white saw that if he takes the pawn, he'll lose his queen, or he'll lose material, and he decided not to do it. But actually, if we look a little further, pawn takes pawn. Thanks for the pawn. Knight f3 check. Now, we can't take with the queen because rook takes rook check will win. So what we have to do is take with the knight. Now, white has a pawn and a knight. Black gets a queen, but white gets the queen back. So if we use Reinfeld numbers, you know, if you looked at my video a few weeks ago where I did the average value of the pieces, we talk about those beginner Reinfeld values, which are rooks are 3, rooks are 5, knights are 3, pawns are 1. White has a pawn, a knight, and a rook for the queen. Well, that's 9 versus 9. If we use more sophisticated numbers, it's not exactly even, but it's close. But the problem for black is that white's got multiple threats. He's threatening to play rook e8 check. He's threatening to play knight e4 and try to remove the guard of the queen on the bishop on h4. And black has trouble meeting all those threats. For instance, suppose black plays bishop d7. White can hit the bishop again with rook to e4. The bishop cannot go to g5. He'd have to play g5 himself. White could just develop the bishop to e3, threatening bishop to d4. And white has all the play. He's gonna be bringing his other rook to the d or e file. The rook on e4 is extremely active. Black's bishop on h4 is out of the game. The computer says if white plays perfectly here, he's winning. So it turns out that after pawn takes pawn, knight f3 check is not even black's best move. After pawn takes pawn, black should just play bishop d7, and then white should play rook f1 with an equal position. But I'm sure white saw that knight f3 check would win the queen. He just didn't realize that after knight takes, rook takes, that white's way better. But of course, anytime someone's threatening to win your queen, you have to ask, are they really winning it or are they just trading it? If you're getting an equal or greater value for the queen, it might be a good trade for you. And that's the case here. If white gives up his queen, he actually gets more than enough for it. And knight f3 check is actually a mistake. Okay, so white plays the very passive move, queen f1. That's a terrible square for the queen. He only has the diagonal now to move, and he doesn't have a lot of great moves on that diagonal. So, if he's not going to take the pawn, which is the best move, and in fact, taking the pawn is the only move that gives him equality, the second best move is to play knight to f3. Queen f1 is more understandable than knight f3, because knight f3, black can mess up white's pawns. But now on queen f1, black's really going to start developing good attack. So black plays d4. The best move there was either queen g6 or d4. Okay. d4, white brings the knight toward the center. The question is, should he go d1 or e2? E2 looks more active. Computer says d1 might be slightly better. So white plays the normal human move, knight to e2. And here the engine suggests black should play either rook d8 or maybe even d3 right away. He plays c5, guarding the pawn. Computer says that's not so good because this bishop can get trapped here on the king side with g3 and f4. And white finds that and correctly plays g3, and now he's back in the game. Black's advantage has shrunk down. What black should do is pin that pawn with the queen so it can't take the bishop. Instead, black makes a mistake. He plays d3. And now if white plays the best move, knight c3, white's back in the lead again thanks to these threats to the bishop. White instead plays knight to f4. The problem with playing knight f4 is that you don't have the fork anymore when the bishop goes to g5. The good news is the knight can go to d5, but the knight could have done that from the c3 square as well. That's why the engine wanted to go to c3 first instead of f4. So black plays bishop g5. These are the kind of positions where you really need to take your time because the pieces are now in great conflict, and these are the kind of moves where you've played the opening relatively quickly, and now you saved your time for these early middle game moves where things are fairly complicated. Engine says the simple d takes c2 is the best with an advantage to black. After bishop g5, it says that's not good because knight d5 hits the queen and is a clearance move to play f4, and that's going to be a big advantage to white. So white sees that, and he correctly plays knight d5, and black plays queen h6. If he plays queen g6, so that on f4 he can take the pawn, it doesn't work anymore because the queen can take, or the knight can take. So f4 here is not going to save the piece. That's why black plays queen to h6, because he figures, even if he forks my piece, at least I can counterattack him on h3. So white plays the only move he can, which is f4. And with perfect play now, white's actually winning. Black plays d takes c2. White says, gee, which piece should I take? Engine suggests the bishop. White takes the bishop, hitting the queen. And the queen takes back, threatening. Queen takes g3 check. So white has to determine what he wants to do here. He's got several moves that stop queen takes g3. He can play king h2. He can play king g2. Instead, he plays a move which is very understandable but may not be the best. He plays queen f4. The problem with that move is the h3 pawn is hanging, and black can continue to attack it multiple times, and if white ever pushes that pawn, these white squares around the king become very weak. So even though when you're ahead you want to trade queens, you really want only fair trades of queens, and here queen f4 is not a queen trade, it's just an offer of a queen trade, and when black turns down the queen trade, black's going to be better. So white plays queen f4, and black of course should not take. As I said, white should have played another move like maybe g4 or even rook a3, getting the rook in the game to guard the pawn. That's a nice rook lift. Easy to miss those kind of moves. Rook a3. He plays queen f4, and the engine says white's lead is much smaller now than it was before. Black plays his best move, queen to h5. And now the engine suggests white should play g4 and allow queen takes h3, but that's a very, very hard move for a human to find. Computer says the second best move is still rook a3. White continues to play inaccurately with b3, and now black's attack is into full roar. He plays knight d3, forking the queen and the rook. White probably didn't see that. White plays the desperado move, knight f6 check, which is a terrible move. He's forking the queen and the rook and the king, but black's just going to take him, and then what did he get for all that? He just lost his beautiful knight for the pawn. So I think this is a panic move. White, what White wrote to me in the email to send me the game and said there's a little hope chess here. Well, hope chess isn't a move like knight f6 check. You're not hoping black moves the king and then you can take off the queen. At least that's never what I meant by hope chess to begin with anyway. If you're not sure what I did, I've done a few videos. One's called Hope Chess, and I have a few other videos on thought process. But in any case, knight f6 is just a bad move. It's just throwing away the knight. And after that move, the game is really not interesting at all. White had to play a move like queen f3. And after queen takes f3, knight f3 guards his rook. Knight takes e1, knight takes e1. Let's say rook takes e4. Knight takes c2. And black has a rook and two pawns for two knights with a very nice looking position. But at least white can still make it kind of a game here. Instead, after knight f6 check, pawn takes, white's got nothing. He actually takes the pawn. Black has all kinds of goodies here. He actually plays his best move, bishop takes h3. This rook is still in big trouble. The knight on d3 is very powerful anyway. He guards the rook with the knight. Black hits the queen to try to remove the guard on the knight. White's completely lost. He has nothing better than trading queens after black takes and white takes. Black now takes the rook, which is not guarded. All right, so what would you take here, the rook or the bishop? Well, rooks are worth 5, bishops are worth 3, but if you take the bishop, you get it for free. Black gets a pawn, of course. If you take the rook, you're not getting the rook for free. You're giving up a knight for the rook. When you have a choice of winning the exchange or winning a piece, you almost always win the piece. And here, knight takes h3 is probably a little better than knight takes e6. The problem is that white's dead lost on both cases because the game is already out of hand once he played knight f6 check. So it really doesn't matter. That's kind of my last comment in the game. The rest of the game, white just played it out to checkmate. We'll just make all those moves really quickly. Black's up a whole piece. Plus he has a pawn on the 7th rank. White says, I'll even trade off and make it easier. This is mop up. Resigns is really good here. I'm not sure why white didn't resign, but okay. If you're not going to resign, you may as well play it out to mate, and that's what white does. Okay, the worst thing you can do is resign one move before mate. That's kind of insulting. If you're going to play out a hopeless position, let your opponent mate you. All right, so hopefully you learned a lot about some of the things we talked about in today's game. We looked at some ABC versus CBA errors. We looked at making prophylactic moves, when they work, when they don't work. We looked at, when you're saving your time for to make moves when things are more critical. We looked at what hope chess wasn't. We got a chance to look at a lot of different things. So I'd like to thank my person who sent me in the game from Sweden. His name is Christian. Christian, thanks for the game. And Christian was not the winner in the game. He was the loser. So a lot of times people, of course, want to send me their winning games, and that's okay. I'll take wins, I'll take draws, I'll take losses. If you do want to send me a game, don't send me the PGN file. I mean, I can open up, that's what I did on this game. You can just copy and paste the PGN of the moves, the text of the moves into an email and send it to me. You can always contact me through my website, danheisman.com. If you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.